Right. All right. Hello, everyone. Just make sure, can everybody hear me okay? Ah, good. Okay, thanks, Dua. All right. Let's see. We got about 23 people here so far. So that's good. Let's share the screen. Oh, come on in, everybody. Come on in. All right. Let's do a screen share. And get the slides ready. So I hope everybody's doing well. If you're in town, I hope that the ongoing protests are not proving too disruptive to you. I'm afraid that they've proven a little disruptive for me, but luckily not to the point where they've seriously hindered the preparation for this class. In fact, I think that a lot of the discussion in the present chapter is actually pretty pertinent to what's going on right now. And I'm hoping that as we make our way through the material today, and as we finish the chapter next time, because I don't think, well, it's not that I don't think, we're not going to get through the entire chapter today. But as we make our way through and as we finish the chapter for our next lecture next week, we'll have lots to talk about. Not just in regards to the imminent protest, but or the ongoing protest, but with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic in general. And I know people are probably sick of hearing about COVID-19, but I think that various responses around the world to the pandemic highlight a lot of the things that we've been talking about, particularly with regard to technocracy. So that might be fun to talk about. And also because, you know, as I make my way through this book, excuse me. As I make my way through this book, I'm noticing more and more that, oh, Julien, you had the same thought. Yeah. I'm glad I'm not the only one. I imagine several others have probably been thinking along the same lines, but yeah, another reason why I'd like to talk about this stuff is because this book, I mean, this is an interesting book. It is a philosophy book, yeah. But it is incredibly heavy on the surveying, and it doesn't really, at least not so far, it doesn't really make an argument, right? There's no arguments yet. Some books, you know, about certain topics will survey the topic and then present a new theory or something and defend it. For example, last semester, I taught a class on the philosophy of the emotions. And the book that I used, it was pretty dry, pretty dense, but pretty good because it surveyed everything really well. But the authors also present their own theory of emotions toward the end, right? So far, nothing like this is happening with this book. So we need to do a lot of the critical engaging with these ideas ourselves, because so far they're just kind of laid out for us. And yeah, it's kind of up to us to critically assess these ideas. So, all right, so let's get started and let's continue our discussion of technocracy, which, if you recall, is ruled by technical experts. Now, the word, as we discussed in our previous lecture, dates to the 20s. So it's a new word for a very old idea. The idea of rule by experts, maybe not necessarily technical experts, but rule by experts goes in the West, at least, back to Plato, right? I'm sure there are examples of technocracy that you could find outside of the West, outside of, you know, I'm using the West in air quotes here, but like, I'm positive that, for example, if you look at some of the systems of social organization in, for example, China, not just today, but throughout history, you'll see a lot of what might be called technocracy as well, right? But unfortunately, the book doesn't really cover that, right? So rule by technical experts, and you can compare this with other similar terms like democracy, which is ruled by the common people and so on. One thing that only really gets emphasized, you know, toward the middle and end of the present chapter is the sort of clashes that can arise between technocracy and democracy. And that's something that's really 20th century technocratic thinkers started to pay close attention to. Previous to this, you don't really see very much concerns about democracy because, well, there weren't that many democracies, right? Democracies really are fairly recent. Yeah, we have the American Revolution, I suppose, is the first major one, and we have well, parliamentary democracy in the British Empire was a thing for sure. But I think it's really with the rise of nation states, which is something that starts to happen in the 19th century. That's when democracy really starts to get widespread. And even then, you could make an argument that it doesn't, because you have the rise of lots of different nation states with, you know, up to and after the First World War. But after that, you have the rise of two pretty big dictatorships, right? Nazi Germany and the USSR. So I don't know. Maybe there's an argument we can make either way, but there certainly are concerns of the compatibility of technocracy and democracy. And I hope we get the chance to talk about that today. Last time, of course, we talked about Plato, who Duzic claimed is not a true technocrat. I'm not sure that I agree with that assessment. I think that Plato's philosopher kings are experts. They may not be technical experts, but they are experts, or they are meant to be experts in how to govern. And on that note, I mean, this is why I also think it's funny that Aristotle is not really discussed as a technocrat. But I guess, again, it's because the ruler, the ideal ruler for Aristotle, somebody who has phronesis or practical wisdom, which he would have called a phronimos, you know. The phronimos is meant to be a good leader, but again, not a technical expert, an expert on leadership, someone who has the right kinds of virtues, but not like a technician, not like the scientists at Francis Bacon's imagined Solomon's house. You know, these would have been actual natural scientists. But again, they would have merely been advising the leadership, similar to how Bacon himself advised King James I, hey, we should build this big research institution in England and use it for the betterment of society. Of course, King James I was not interested in that. So that's where we left off. Now we want to look at some of the other thinkers. But before that, a question. If you allow Plato's government to be included in technocracy, does that make it so simply wanting your rulers to know how to rule is sufficient for technocracy? I guess it depends on, right? It depends on whether government is a kind of technology, I guess. And I suppose most people don't think of it this way, but I mean, I'm thinking back to Hobbes here, right? Like, I believe it was Karl Mannheim who, in the previous chapter, we learned about Mannheim and his idea that, you know, the first technology was really big organized groups of people, not their tools, but the people using them and how they're organized. So think of somebody like, think of the ancient Egyptians organizing to build, the Great Pyramid or something, a very long involved project. I believe archaeological estimates put it at 20-25 years to build this thing. Thousands of people working over the course of many, many years. This had to be incredibly well organized, and it's that entire social thing that is the technology. And that reminded me of Hobbes, who of course famously argued that the state is a giant artificial person, the Leviathan. And when you read when you read about this idea of government in the eponymous book Leviathan by Hobbes, he starts out not talking about government at all. He's talking about the human being, right? And right there in the preface, well, I don't have my copy of Leviathan with me. Whoa. But I do have a quote, which I'll read to you. Boy, it's been forever since I've opened this thing up. Oh my gosh. Where did I put it? So this is the introduction from Hobbes' Leviathan. Nature, the art whereby God hath made and governs the world, is by the art of man, as in many other things, so in this also imitated, that it can make an artificial animal. For seeing life is but a motion of limbs, the beginning whereof is in some principal part within, why may we not say that all automata, engines that move themselves by springs and wheels, as doth a watch, have an artificial life? For what is the heart but a spring, and the nerves but so many strings, and the joints but so many wheels, giving motion to the whole body, as was intended by the artificer? So that's the human being for Hobbes. The human being is a machine, an automaton, fashioned by God, many would have argued at this time, although I suspect Hobbes himself was probably an atheist. He nonetheless uses the vernacular of his day, right? And he says, well, the human being is a machine, and if you want to govern the state effectively, you need the right machine. The government is like a giant machine made of all of the people in the government, and you need a strong ruler, a strong sovereign as the brain of the machine, right? So artificer, yeah, he's talking about God. So if you conceive of government like Hobbes does, and it's kind of like this Mannheimian kind of technology, then yeah, I guess your rulers are technocrats, and you want them to have knowledge of their craft, of their techne, that is to rule, right? Anyway, once we get closer to the present day, we bump into Claude Henri de Rouvois. I'm bad at pronouncing French. Anyway, he was the Comte de Saint Simone. So like a count, he was a noble person. He had a title. He had probably some land and a nice house. But he was a very interesting character. He imagines scientists and technologists playing a more direct role in political rule than the scientists at Solomon's house that were imagined by Bacon, for example. And he himself was a very politically active individual. He participated in the American Revolution, right? Traveled over, I assume, would have had to go there and be physically present in America. Although I'm not quite sure of the details of that. And just a short while later, he would participate in the French Revolution. And this is quite interesting, right? Because if you know your history, well, the American Revolution happened first. The Americans, of course, had support from French Republicans. especially because I mean, really, support from the French in general, but you know, the French and the English were quite antagonistic towards one another, and since you know, the American colonies were rebelling against their British, the British Empire, and ruled by the British Empire, the French backed that. So he's involved in this, and then a short time later, France has its own revolution, the first of a few, actually, and he participates in this. And yeah, I'm not sure if we have any history buffs, but we have the French Revolution, and following the French Revolution, we have something called the Reign of Terror, right? The Reign of Terror is, you know, the days of the guillotine. A lot of the nobility lost their heads, right, in the aftermath of the French Revolution. But Saint Simone, he renounced his title, and he participated in the revolution, and he actually made quite a lot of money while he was doing this, because there was a lot of property that was being seized and sold. So he made money by stripping, you know, precious materials from the homes of the wealthy. At one point, he even proposed selling the roof of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. That was how, I guess, cunning he was in his financial dealings, right? So he made himself a fortune in the aftermath of the revolution. But of course, he no longer considers himself a nobleman, right? He renounces his title, but he's still a very flamboyant, kind of over-the-top character, right? Duzic tells us in this chapter that his valet was under orders to awaken him in the morning by announcing, "Arise, Count, you have great things to do today," right? Very over the top. He kind of reminds me of, like, you know, like an over the top billionaire that we might have today. Kind of reminds me a little bit of like a Richard Branson or an Elon Musk kind of figure. So that's Saint Simone, a little bit of an introduction. What else can we say about him? Well, he was a bit of an autodidact. I'll spell that out. Oh, Jack Ma, yeah, Jack Ma is maybe another interesting example. He's the Alibaba guy, right? From the Chinese equivalent of eBay, Amazon. Yeah, he was eccentric. I would say very eccentric, and also an autodidact, which I will spell now. An autodidact is someone who is self-educated, right? Auto, self, didact, from didactic, like teaching, learning, education. So he's self-educated. He hung around the famous École Polytechnique, talked to a lot of scientists of the day. I mean, remember, he had money, so a lot of people like him, as we learned about this in previous chapters, even if they weren't formally educated in science, if they had money, they could invite scientists to come to their place, throw like fancy, extravagant dinner parties, and talk about science with the scientists of the day. So that was one of the ways that you know, some of these wealthy technocrats learned about science. If they didn't go to university, if they didn't study science, maybe they had studied law or the humanities, which many probably did, they could still invite over the leading physicists and say, hey, you know, teach me some physics over the course of the evening. And they would, right? So Saint Simone probably was doing quite a lot of that. And he, of course, eschewed the feudal system. The feudal system was kind of on its way out for a while by this point, but still very much there. this is why wealthy landowners and monarchs have all this power prior to the revolution, right? It's still, the society is still organized along the lines of the feudal system. And of course, he was not a fan of organized religion as well, which was a big part of the feudal system. All in all, he thought all of this was wasteful and superstitious. Duzic writes, he provocatively opens one essay with the claim that if one morning the nation woke up to find all the clergy and nobility gone, the nation would not suffer. But if all of the scientists, technicians, and business people were gone, society would collapse. And that's maybe a bit of a dangerous thing to say at this time. The alternative that Saint Simon predicted, and this is why I kind of think of him as a sort of eccentric billionaire type, is that he's essentially predicting industrial society here. What's his replacement for the feudal society? Industrial society, highly centralized society that's managed by technicians, if you like. And we're going through a similar transformation now, or we have been for the past little while. For example, in North America, manufacturing has largely moved offshore and happens in other economies. For example, a lot of goods are manufactured in China, right? It didn't used to be this way, but the American economy has shifted to a kind of information-based economy, as has ours, as have many countries in Europe. So the same kind of shift that we're going through and have been going through from industrialism to the sort of information age, Saint Simon is kind of sitting on another one of those shifts, kind of between feudalism and industrialism. So that's interesting. That's interesting as well. What else do we got? Well, he kind of changes. He kind of flip-flops on how he sees society. What the best society would be. Sometimes he's writing as if he envisions a capitalist society, and sometimes he's writing as if he is envisioning a socialist society. It kind of changes here and there, depending on which of his works you're reading, right? But in every case, they're highly centralized and they're ruled by experts, which he called the Council of Newton, right after Isaac Newton, who was the foremost scientific mind of the day, right? So what does Duzic say about this? Well, whether we're socialists or capitalists in the new society that Saint Simon envisions, whoa, excuse me. Oh, so sleepy. Whether we're capitalists or socialists, quote, scientists, technicians, industrialists, and bankers filled the seats of various versions of the council. Priests and nobility were eliminated from the new society. So that's very interesting. I think it's very interesting, and I will pause to come back to some of these ideas, get some discussion going in a moment. But further, he's famous for coining a number of new words, right? Individualism, physicist, organizer, industrialist, positivist. These are all terms that were coined by Saint Simon, which are now in widespread use, not just in French, right? But in many languages, including English, of course. And his influence can still be seen in many places. Probably during the 20th century, it was very apparent in the USSR, but it's also apparent in some places in the West. Duzic writes here, quote, Lenin described the future social organization, of communism. Let's go back. Of communism using the Saint Simonian terms, society as one vast factory and the organization of things and not of men. Stalin used Saint Simon's phrase to characterize artists as engineers of the human spirit. Ironically, because capitalism, a similar notion appears in the designation of the technicians at Disneyland as Imagineers, or engineers of the imagination. Saint Simon's views, unlike those of Plato and Bacon, present a fully fledged technocracy. In some of his presentations, at least, the experts literally rule. So before we go on to our next thinker, I think it would be interesting to pose the question, is Saint Simone, obviously he's being provocative. Well, it's not a direct quote, but this suggestion that if all the clergy and nobility were gone, society would be fine. But if all the scientists, technicians, and business people disappeared, society would be pretty screwed. Do we agree that he's right about society at the time he would have written this? Or alternatively, is he perhaps saying something with a grain of truth to it that applies to the society that we live in? I'd be curious to hear what everybody thinks about that. Let's open the chat window in case people want to chat.
Hi, Professor. Could you just repeat the question?
So the question was, like, he's saying provocatively that if nobility disappears, the clergy disappears, society would not suffer, but it would suffer if the scientists and technicians and business people were all to disappear suddenly. Is this true of the time he lived in, or is it true now?
I mean, I guess the first one depends on whether or not you're religious or not, but assuming like we're talking to someone that doesn't consider the clergy as something special, like I would say that, well, scientists, technicians, and business, I don't know about business people, but scientists and technicians definitely need like rigorous training to, perform a lot of technical jobs well. Whereas like, I feel many people can naturally climatize to the business or political or clergy environment because based off of like social interaction a lot more. Not to say that scientists technicians don't socially interact. I'm saying that I feel like, hey man, I'm a certified arts major myself. So what can I say?
Right.
That's what I'm saying. Like, there's a certain skill needs to be developed, but also like it's more specialized, I feel, with scientists technicians. So
yeah. In the chat here, Stefan says the loss of nobility would lead to a lot of power vacuums. Yeah. Well, I mean, in a way, there was a loss of nobility, wasn't there, in the French Revolution? Yeah, and Zach, that's a good point. So would loss of clergy. I mean, think of somebody like Napoleon, right? Napoleon Bonaparte. He can declare himself emperor if he wants, right? But doesn't it look a lot better if the Pope declares you the emperor, right? And he puts that crown on your head, right? I mean, so maybe you do need the clergy. And of course, Napoleon was an autocrat, but not a member of the nobility. He was a military guy, right? I think this is an interesting take. Personally speaking, I have no religious affiliations myself, and I tend to think that at least for others like me, were all of the priests or whatever to disappear, that certainly wouldn't affect my life. It may affect other people's lives, maybe more religious people's lives. But it's funny because back in the day, prior to the French Revolution, but really not that prior. I mean, if you wanted an education, you would probably get that in a sort of religious or semi-religious, from a religious or semi-religious institution. A lot of the scholarship that was done in the Dark Ages, for example, was done not just at old universities like Oxford, but at monasteries. There's another famous scholar named Bacon, Roger Bacon, who was a monk, right? William of Ockham, monk. Thomas Aquinas, right? Theologian. It's interesting because a lot of the findings of the scientists of the early modern through the modern period would undermine the authority of the church, and yet A lot of them were educated by the church. Even think of somebody like Rene Descartes, right? Who, made some pretty important lasting contributions to mathematics and geometry. He was educated as a Jesuit, which is like a philosopher priest kind of thing, right? So I don't know. I think that's quite provocative. It's an interesting idea, but I don't know how true it is. Intuitively, at first, I want to go, yeah. But then when I think about it, I'm like, oh, I don't know, though. I'm really not sure. So, yeah, let's see. What else did I want to ask about before I've forgotten my other question that I wanted to put to all of you. Well, okay, this part at the end, in some of his presentations at least, the experts literally rule. Now, here's a chance for some interesting discussion, because earlier when I was talking about Plato and his Technocracy, I said that while Duzek doesn't agree that Plato is like a genuine technocrat, if we think of governing as a sort of technical skill, then Plato's philosopher kings are the experts, right? But what if we don't think of things that way, right? What if there are people who are good at governing, and maybe they're not technocrats in the sense that Duzek is discussing here. They're not technocrats because they're not technical experts, right? They're not scientists or engineers, but they are good at governing. Do we want those people in charge? Like, we're talking, career politicians, government employees, stuff like that. Do we want those people to rule, or do we want literally experts, technical experts? Do we want actual scientists and engineers ruling society, or not ruling necessarily, but governing? Does anyone have a preference, or anyone have any thoughts on that? Good at governing. Well, I guess what I mean when I say that is somebody who's an effective ruler. Somebody who, like Aristotle would have said, somebody who has practical wisdom, I suppose, right? Someone who can see what is going to be good for society and who knows how to get it done, right? So I suppose that's what I mean by somebody who's good at governing. Someone who has a rapport with with the people that he or she governs, someone who knows what would be good for those people and who knows how to get it. Somebody who's honest, this is a highly idealized idea of a politician. I realize that, but do we want politicians, or do we want scientists and engineers? Yeah, I mean, maybe we could have somebody that's capable of both. And there are people like that we're going to talk about, like I don't know, Herbert Hoover. We're going to talk about Herbert Hoover in a bit. Let's see. So yeah, Zach, yeah, that's a fair point. That's a fair point. Maybe there are people that can do both. Depends on the type of system, Henrique says. Much rather have someone who knows how to govern rather than an expert in a different field where they might have good ideas, but that are completely detached from a practical standpoint. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. A scientist or an engineer might make, say we're thinking of a country like Canada, maybe it would be good to have a scientist, like a climate scientist or something, as Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, right? That would be a good thing. That would be a good position for them. Would Prime Minister be a good position for them? No, maybe not, right? That's what I'm kind of saying there. So yeah, I think Henrique, and I think I probably agree with what you say there, that it probably depends. Yeah, it depends also not just on the people we're talking about, but on the style of government that we're talking about. So Zach says, someone who has only ever studied physics isn't great for ruling, but someone who has only been taught governing can't understand science. Yeah, that's an excellent point. And that's why I think there's really something to be said for Bacon's kind of technocracy, right? Where we don't have the actual technicians doing the ruling. They just advise the ruler. So we have somebody who's good at governing, maybe a good sovereign or an elected official, right? Doesn't matter, but we need somebody who's good at governing. And then we need people who are technical experts who can advise the people who are doing the governing. I think that's what I think would be like the ideal way to do things. And indeed, that's very much how it works now in most in most democracies in the world today, right? Let's take it all the way back to Plato. Why did Plato think that you even needed, whether they count as technical experts or not, why do we need the philosopher kings? It goes back, you can get some hints about this in the way that Plato has Socrates talk about democracy. I'm not sure how many of you have read any of Plato's stuff, but actually real quick, I mean, how many of you have read Plato? Has anybody read The Republic and maybe The Apology? Doesn't seem like it. Huh. I suppose that speaks to the diversity of different majors that we have in the class, not just philosophy majors, right? Tess has read some of The Republic. Okay. I really think you get the sense of this in The Republic and also in The Apology. The Apology, by the way, or Apologia, was Socrates' defense at his trial. You see, Socrates, talking about ruling, who should be in charge and whether they're good at it. Socrates was kind of an annoyance to the people in charge in Athens. He likened himself to a gadfly, right? Probably you've heard this before. Socrates is a gadfly. What's a gadfly? Gadfly is like a horsefly. And Athens is this big, beautiful horse, but it's old and lazy. And the gadfly has to come and sting it and wake it up, right? So Socrates is being a gadfly. He's asking the tough questions of people in power. He's asking tough questions about the people who claim to be educating the youth, right? He thinks that the sophists, for example, the philosophers of the day who would teach people for money, they're not teaching people virtue. They're not teaching people philosophy. They're just teaching people how to be like, kind of sleazy, right? Socrates himself was accused of being a sophist, and he was accused of corrupting the youth, and he was put on trial, and he had to defend himself against these charges. Of course, it didn't go well. His arguments did not succeed, and he was condemned to die. But good old Socrates, he loves his city of Athens so much that he says, even though I disagree with your verdict, I love my city so much. If this is what you want, I'll do it. He could have gone into exile. He didn't. Instead, he was executed by drinking hemlock. Also not a very good way to go, because hemlock initiates this kind of ascending paralysis until it gets to your lungs, and then you just suffocate. So not a good way to go. Poor Socrates. So Socrates is accused of corrupting the youth. He's accused of impiety. And sure, at the end of the trial, he accepts the verdict. But during the trial, he is quite disdainful of the democratic nature of what's happening, and he lets that be known. Has anyone heard that term, hoi polloi? I'll spell it here. The hoi polloi. No one's heard this? Hoi polloi? It's a great word. The general people, right? The hoi polloi, the common folk, or really more literally, the rabble, right? The hoi polloi is an onomatopoeia. a word that sounds like what it is, what it represents. The hoi polloi were the rabble, the mob. Yeah. And that our word for rabble is the same, rabble, 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 rabble. That's the rabble, right? The Greeks had a lot of onomatopoetic words. I don't know why. What are some other good ones? Good Greek onomatopoeias. Now I'm blanking on them. But yeah, the hoi polloi. Socrates was not a fan of democracy because the rabble, you're going to have the rabble govern? What? You're going to give everyone a vote? What? Well, not everyone, because it's ancient Greece, just older men. But Socrates is thinking, but you're going to give these guys a vote? These guys who have been educated by sophists, making the weaker argument the stronger? No. Socrates he wanted none of that. Socrates was quite anti-democratic. What did he want instead? Well, I guess he wanted some kind of statesperson who had the right kinds of virtues. And if you read the Meno, for example, Plato has Socrates kind of end the dialogue by telling the reader that virtue maybe isn't the kind of thing that can be taught. It may come from the gods. So yeah, that's something that I wanted to get back to because I don't think I ever really I don't think I've mentioned that so far. But yeah, Socrates, Plato, even I think Aristotle were not super into democracy, because democracy didn't work for the ancient Greeks. They had a democracy. Their democracy led them in a war with Sparta that they lost. So yeah. Oh, let's see. I guess we better move on to Compt. But just keep that in mind. The sort of if you're thinking of Plato's Technocracy, or if you're thinking of indeed, if you're ever talking about government and you're talking about the pros and cons of democracy. I mean, democracy is great because it gives everybody a voice. But Socrates would say democracy is also not great for the same reason, right? So yeah, that's democracy for you. Or as Winston Churchill famously said, what did he say? Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all of the other ones, right? I think maybe Socrates would have agreed on that. I don't know. But anyway, now we get to Auguste Comte. Comte was a follower of Saint Simone, and he attended the École Polytechnique, where Saint Simone was also kind of a hangabout. But Comte was eventually expelled. Whoops. He was expelled because he participated in a protest against the new monarchy. Again, I'm not a history expert, but France has a revolution. Then they have a reign of terror. Somewhere down the line, Napoleon becomes emperor. Napoleon is defeated by the British, and he's kind of sent into exile. And France gets its monarchy back. And I guess Saint Simone, or not Saint Simone, but Auguste Comte was protesting the new monarchy and got himself into a bit of trouble with the administrators of the school. So he's a politically active guy, is the point, right? And he organized and expanded upon a lot of Saint Simone's ideas. One of these kind of central sort of doctrines that he's most known for is his law of the three stages. It's not really a scientific law. I wouldn't even call it a hypothesis, really. This is kind of it's kind of pseudoscientific by today's standards. But he claims that society evolves through a number of stages, 3, as the name implies, right? First, society goes through like a theological stage, a religious stage, and then into a metaphysical stage, or like a philosophy stage, and then to a scientific stage. So, and again, like there's a lot of thinkers at this time that look at history in this kind of way. This is kind of a new way to look at history. Maybe started with Hegel. I don't know. Don't quote me on that. But this idea of progress, right? This is progress, what Comte is talking about. This is a new idea. The idea that things can get better over time. This is new, right? If you look at ancient cultures around the world, let's take the Greeks, for example. The Greeks' understanding of the cosmos was cyclical. The same things happen, they just keep happening, right? A really great example I think you can also find in Hinduism, right? Things are cyclical. There's a flow, or Taoism in ancient China. No, there's a kind of flow. There's a right kind of flow for everything. The flow of energy or chi between yin and yang, and things don't really get better or worse. They just kind of cycle. Human society kind of mirrors the cycle of nature. This idea of progress was very new. It happened in the modern period. Yeah, like the eternal return. Yeah, as Julian says, it's a cycle of time, a wheel of time, I guess, right? But then in the modern period, which is the time we're at now, kind of going from the modern period until the Enlightenment, people start talking about progress. The idea that we don't have to be maybe history isn't cyclical. Maybe we're actually progressing toward an end, right? And Hegel, I guess, is probably, if not the first, one of the more famous representatives of this kind of thinking. But so is Comte, right? And this way of thinking is, it's not just these guys. Also Marx and Engels, right? Marx is very much a Hegelian, I think. But he just, maybe he's a Hegelian in some sense. He's not like a transcendental idealist. He's very much a materialistic thinker, but he did see history as being driven in this dialectical fashion, like Hegel did. But it was not reason itself; it was class struggle that moves history along. And the end of history is socialism, when we get to like a proper socialist state, right? Most recently, the one person I can think of is Francis Fukuyama, who wrote a book that was literally called The End of History, right? And his end of history thesis was the idea that when the Cold War ended, liberal democracy had won. Liberal democracy was the best. It proved that socialism wouldn't work. And now there's no history left. Nothing new is going to happen. We just have to manage our liberal democracies and help them spread around the world, and everything's great. Yeah, okay, worked for a little while. But then 9/11 happened. And we kind of moved, I think we moved very quickly out of a post-Cold War sort of idealistic way of looking at the world, like Fukuyama was at the time. Like, okay, liberal democracy has won, reason has won, and then 9/11 happens, and we kind of realize, yeah, I guess not everybody's into liberal democracy, right? So nonetheless, that's another example of this kind of progressive thinking. So let's get back to Comte. Actually, how are we doing for time? Wow. I'm just blabbing away here, taking up so much time. Come on, slides. Let's go to the next slide. We've got to finish talking about Comte, and then I want to talk about Veblen. So, yeah, progress, like I was just talking about. His slogan was order and progress. And you actually see this on the flag of Brazil to this day. It says it in Latin. Latin or Portuguese. I'm actually not sure. But it's there. It's on the flag. And similarly, there were positivist thinkers involved in a lot of interesting political developments throughout the 18th and 19th century in Latin America as well. It is Portuguese, eh? Oh, okay. Thanks, Enrique. Yeah. So yeah, order in progress on the Brazilian flag. Oh yeah, I was gonna say I just noticed your name. I'm like, oh, Enrique. Yeah, you must be Brazilian. So that's cool. Thank you. I know nothing of Brazilian Portuguese, so I appreciate that. If anyone needs to jump in and correct me on anything at any time, please do. I'm here to learn just like you are. So Comte imagined that we should replace, in our ideal society, we should replace literally the hierarchy of the Catholic Church with scientists, right? Let's keep the hierarchy, but replace the priests with scientists. Instead of the Pope, we'll have like the chief scientist, or whatever we want to call him. The bishops get replaced by scientists. The priests are replaced. A hierarchy of technical experts, right? Almost like like an academic hierarchy, at a university, kind of. I don't know if that's the kind of society I'd like to live in. It's kind of nice to get away from the university every once in a while, isn't it? But his views were highly influential in the 20th century. And indeed, Comte is the one who coined the term sociology as a scientific field, the field of the scientific study of society. There were other people doing similar work around the same time and after, but Comte coined that term. And he also thought of sociology as the queen of the sciences, right? Depending on who you talk to, the queen of the sciences is it changes depending on who you ask, right? Sometimes it's physics, sometimes it's philosophy, right? Sometimes it's sociology. And I should mention that Comte is probably one of the last people we're going to look at that sees the technocrats, the technicians, the experts. He's probably the last guy we're going to talk about who wants them to be actual scientists and engineers. When we get further on into like the 20th century, for example, when we talk about Thorstein Veblen here, our experts are the sociologists themselves, right? Not physicists, not engineers, but sociologists, political scientists, economists, stuff like that, right? So social scientists. Okay, so now we got Thorstein Veblen, who was a Norwegian-American economist and a very interesting character if you've read the section of him in the book. This is around the time. Oh no, I forgot to put the guy's name. Oh no, that's a pretty bad mistake. In the 1920s, American economist coined the term technocracy. It was John Hull, I believe his name was, who coined that term. And Thorstein Veblen was an influential technocratic theorist around that time. He was a critic of the sort of Gilded Age society. This is the Roaring 20s, right? Has anyone heard of the Gilded Age? Have you talked about the Gilded Age in maybe a sociology class, or maybe history of the 20th century class? Anybody familiar with the Gilded Age? How about the television show? I think a TV show called The Gilded Age just dropped. That'll give you a clue. It's by the dude who did Downton Abbey. So, no? Nobody? Okay, so the Gilded Age is like the Roaring 20s, the opulence, the debauchery, the excess, the opulent lifestyle of the wealthy. Yeah, Dula, there you go. Materialism, political corruption, everything leading up to the crash of 29. Prior to that, the American economy was booming. People were, dancing, listening to jazz, going to the club, smoking, drinking, um, even drug use. With jazz in the music scene, this is where a lot of people were probably first introduced to cannabis, actually. So Gilded Age society, yeah, a little political corruption, materialism, people flaunting their wealth, right? Think of the Roaring 20s. Rich people are showing off their wealth, not just to say, hey, I'm rich, but also you're poor, right? And Torstein Veblen did not like that. He was very critical of this society, and he also disdained academia. He disdained the elitism and the formalism of it. And yeah, I mean, I guess I get it, man. What was I going to say? There was something else. Oh yeah, in the textbook you can read about how Duzek describes this instance where Veblen had written this economy book, an economics book that he wanted to get published with an academic publisher, and he wasn't interested in doing like a mathematical stuff. He wasn't that kind of economist, right? He was kind of more, I guess, maybe more like a political economist rather than like a numbers guy. And they said to him, you can't publish this book. There's no math in it. Can't publish an economics book with no math. So what does Veblen do? He just sticks a bunch of nonsense mathematical formulas into a series of footnotes. They don't make any sense. And he just resubmits it and they publish it. I mean, that's hilarious. I think of the Gilded Age as the Roaring 20s, but in the 19th century. I mean, in the 19th century, I guess there is a lot of, there's a lot of opulent stuff going on. But the Gilded Age does refer to the teens and the 20s in America, right? But yeah, precursor to the so-called hoax. Maybe. Although I don't think Veblen was trying to discredit anyone here. I think he was just trying to, he didn't care, right? And he got in trouble for his behavior sometimes. I remember, if you again, this isn't in the slides, but if you read the textbook, I mean, this man lived in a tent off of the Harvard campus at one point in his career. I mean, this is an eccentric guy. Like, it's a really eccentric guy, just being kind of eccentric, right? So, at the time, we got the Roaring 20s and the lead up, and then finally in 1929, market crash, the Great Depression. So Veblen's living through all of this, and he sees that business at the time was wasteful and inefficient. Engineers, they're the efficient folks. They're who we should have running society. That's what he even uses this term Soviet of engineers, because he's inspired by the Russian Revolution and the rise of communism, right, which had happened before. Sorry, I distracted my phone. My family's checking up on me because I'm in Ottawa and with all this stuff happening. So he uses this term Soviet of engineers. Hey, let's talk about Soviet. What does that word mean? Can anyone tell me? I'm asking a lot of like historical questions. I know this is not a history class, but like I'm kind of a history nerd, and I don't know. I don't think we can talk about philosophy of technology without talking about the Soviet Union. I mean, come on, right? So anyone know Soviet? What is Soviet? Well, kind of. I mean, it's meant to be like a grassroots sort of thing, right? Soviet essentially means the equivalent of the English word grassroots. And the idea of a Soviet, like we have all these Soviets that are in a union. The idea is that it's the proletariat and only the proletariat, right? The working class that rule. So the Soviet is like, the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? So this is the term that he uses. Let's have a Soviet of engineers. But he's very careful, especially with the rise of Stalin and the forced modernization that Stalin would go on to implement in the Soviet Union, led to a lot of people starving to death. So yeah, kind of similar to the Great Leap Forward in China. And of course, for all the socialist utopian talk of the Russian revolutionaries, along comes a guy like Stalin, who is I mean, when I read about Stalin, I feel like I'm reading about a stone cold psychopath, a really evil guy. He would have a lot of people disappeared. He would have a lot of people sent to the gulags. We think of, or at least I think a lot of people think of, if you ask who's the most evil person of the 20th century, a lot of people would tell you Adolf Hitler. And absolutely, Adolf Hitler was an evil guy. Absolutely. But we forget about how evil Stalin was. If you disagreed with Hitler, he would just fire you, right? If you disagreed with Stalin, or even if you just started to look a little more successful, or if people liked you a little bit more than Stalin, you would disappear, right? This guy was ruthless. So Veblen has to, be a little bit careful. He doesn't want to look like a radical, right? A radical Stalinist. And he has a follower. He has a follower named Howard Scott, who kind of continues the tradition of the technocratic movement. How are we doing for time? Okay, we're getting there. Come on, my slides. They're so slow. Go back. Oh, I was on the right slide. And there's a thing in the chat. Yes, exactly. People would have a nice trip. You want to go on a nice vacation, comrade? Like, yeah. So, I don't know. Would not want to be on the wrong side of Stalin. So Scott had a bit of a following, which actually reemerged during the Great Depression, for obvious reasons. America during the Gilded Age, America was great. The war was over. The economy was doing very well. I think Americans kind of wanted, America was quite isolationist at the time too. America did not want to, they just wanted to kind of do their thing. They eschewed involvement in a lot of political events, at that time, probably up until the Second World War, right? First with the Lend-Lease Act, and then with actually entering the war. They wanted to stay out of global politics before that because they were doing well, but then the Depression hit. The Depression actually did not affect America for as long or as severely as it did affect some other economies. But that's kind of outside the scope of the class. The point is that Scott's following reemerged. And to quote from Duzek here, Scott's technocrats combined the conditioning of human behavior following the behaviorist psychologists Ivan Pavlov and John Watson with their conception of society run as a machine by engineer experts. Very Mannheimian, very Hobbesian, right? At least it strikes me as so. These ideas didn't really catch on. Like at the time, there were technocratic societies, right? Like clubs. Scott was kind of like kind of an interesting fella who would hang around in the sort of like cafe culture in Greenwich Village in New York. So very, very like, let's sit down and, like salon culture had been in France during the Enlightenment. Let's have some coffee and talk about ideas, That's kind of what Scott was, that was his scene, right? But a lot of those movements kind of went away. That's those sort of, not clubs, but like technocratic societies kind of faded by the end of the 30s. However, a tendency toward technocracy did kind of spread, not like an overt movement, but some of these ideas did pick up steam. The technocratic tendency, Duzick writes on page 47, diffused widely throughout American society in the progressive movement of the period around the First World War and in the New Deal. The New Deal was a response to the Great Depression when FDR created a bunch of jobs, stimulated the economy. Like, we're in the Great Depression, we need to get people working. So, okay, let's invest in American infrastructure. Let's build roads. Let's build bridges. Let's build stuff we need and let's pay people to do it and get them back to work. So that was the kind of thing that he was doing. That to continue, both the progressive movement and the New Deal were responses to social disorganization and crises. Yeah. The progressives reacted against corrupt city political machines and price gouging monopolies. Yeah. Even a very ardent capitalist and also engineer. I told you we'd talk about Herbert Hoover, after whom the Hoover Dam is named. And he would go on to become the president of the United States. Their influence was predominantly within, the progressive area of politics, the Social Democrats. Hoover nonetheless believed that the engineer was an ideal person to manage society, and he went on to become the president of the United States. So although I'm not really familiar with how successful his terms, I don't even know how long he was in office. So elsewhere around the world, in Sweden, you had thinkers like Gunnar and Alva Myrdal, and they advocated for technocracy, but crucially, and this is very important, they also saw the importance of integrating technocracy with democracy. That's very important. Why? Well, again, Soviet Union, right? Nazi Germany. Talk about that in a sec, but very technocratic, very authoritarian, right? Absolutely not democracies. And I think Gunnar and Alva Myrdal were aware of this. They were aware of this worry, right? Likewise with Karl Mannheim, who was in Germany. He emphasized the value of these kind of free-floating intellectuals who could travel freely and share knowledge and help with how to run democracies. It's kind of ironic. I mean, Mannheim had to flee Germany during the rise of Nazism in the 30s, right? So he had to get the heck out of there. And like I kind of gestured at earlier, in these thinkers' theories, the technocrats are not actual physicists. They're not engineers. They're not natural scientists. Rather, they are social scientists. So the technocrats, if you ask the Myrdals or Mannheim, they're going to say, well, if you want technocrats, you want sociologists, you want political scientists, you want economists, right? You don't want a physicist, no, but you do want a scientist, but you want one of those scientists that studies human society, right? That's what you need for your technocracy, these thinkers would say. And it's important to note, and this is what I hope we get to talk about next time. Next time, we're going to finish this chapter and have a little chat about democracy. It's important to make sure that these two are not at odds, is because, as I mentioned, the USSR and Nazi Germany, the two biggest dictatorships of the 20th century, had very strong technocratic elements to them, right? Nazism is a weird mixed bag at first, right? It had like weird naturalistic anti-technological elements in it. even Hitler, when he was first kind of brought into the German Workers' Party, which is what the NASDAP, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, was called before it became the Nazi Party. He was recruited by this guy who was a member of a society called the Tula Society. It's not spelled the way you think. Probably it's spelled like this. This was like a weird occult society that wanted to get into politics, and they figured that Hitler would be a very good public speaker for them, which he was. And eventually Hitler outgrew the Tula Society. The German Workers' Party abandoned any pretenses that it was actually a socialist party and became the National Socialist Party, which again, it's National Socialist. The socialist part is for all intents and purposes meaningless. It was PR. They were not socialists by any stretch of the imagination. They were authoritarian. So even Hitler too also had an interest in like bizarre health trends. He was a vegetarian. He had an interest in the occult. But the technocratic elements won out during the war. And if you really want to get a sense of this, you should watch this film called Conspiracy. It's a film about the Wannsee Conference, which was the conference put on by General Reinhard Heydrich, where the final solution was planned and implemented. This is where a bunch of people got together, a bunch of technocrats got together and solved, tried to work out how they were actually going to implement the final solution. How were they going to do a genocide against the Jewish people? Dark moment in human history for sure. But this film is a very good depiction of the technocracy of the Nazis, right? Oh, right. Yeah. Mackenzie King, right? Yeah. Also, we have to remember, the Nazis were not good dudes. They were evil, that's for sure. But around the same time, and this is something we have to reckon with ourselves in our own history as Canadians, we had eugenics movements here too. The Holocaust emerged out of what was essentially a eugenics movement, sterilizing people with mental and physical disabilities, sterilizing political undesirables, moved on from sterilizing to killing. We did that here. They did it in America. We had eugenics programs in the late 19th and early 20th century. We did it here. It was particularly bad in Canada with respect to the mentally and physically ill and the First Nations. Eugenics is kind of wrapped up in the history of residential schools here, and this is something that I don't think that we haven't reckoned with this. Canada has not properly reckoned with this. We like to say Canada's great. We didn't have slavery. We fought against the Nazis. Yes, those things are true. But we also had eugenics and residential schools. Okay. So I'm just saying, if you believe in progress, there's always room for some more of that progress, right? But we have to make sure we stay democratic. Of course, the Soviet Union, I think, is maybe the best example. You've got Stalin forcefully industrializing the Soviet economy, right? Keyword, forcefully. People didn't have a choice. Russia, up until this point, had been, their farming system, their system of agriculture had basically just been like the feudal system. They rapidly modernized, very rapidly. But it didn't go all that smoothly. So concerns about technocracy and its relationship to democracy are very important. And I want to talk about this next time. We're going to finish off the chapter. And then I want to have a little chat about technocracy and COVID-19, because we've definitely seen some technocracy in action with the pandemic. Definitely, right? If you turn on American television, you know, you've got thinkers like Dr. Anthony Fauci. Here we've got Theresa Tam, experts advising the people who govern. And we have people that are, with various skills at governing, right? When the pandemic started in the United States, we had Donald Trump as the president. Not a very good politician, if you ask me. You know, now we've got Biden. You know, whatever you think about Biden, he is a career politician, for better or worse. At least he knows how to do the job. Whether you approve of the job he's doing is a different story. And similarly in Canada, you know, I think, you know, I don't think that the this is not to get into personal politics or anything, but I think that the Trudeau government has done an okay job. Things certainly could have been worse, but they certainly could have been better as well. Yeah. Trump is like the anti-technocrat, anti-politician, right? Someone who doesn't know about governing or science. Trump. Okay, so a leader like Trump is like why Socrates hated democracy, right? I mean, there you go. That captures it, at least for me. I do believe in democracy. I'm kind of like with Churchill on this one. It's the worst system of government except for all the other ones, right? Whatever kind of thing we do, whether we're going to be capitalist or socialist, we got to have proper democracy. But there are problems, right? You can have a rabble rouser like Trump stirring up emotions and whipping up a base and winning an election. I didn't think that would happen. I mean, for goodness sake, when I saw that he would announce his candidacy all those years ago, I thought this will never happen. And boy, did I eat my words. Anyway, that's it for today, everyone. Let's get together on Tuesday and we'll finish up the chapter and, you know, watch the news, see what's going on. Have a chat with friends and family, maybe some political discussions. Try and bring the technocratic elements of our response to the COVID-19 pandemic to the forefront, right? And we'll talk about the relationship between technocracy and democracy using this present example of the pandemic and our response to it, you know, as our food for thought, as our food for discussion. So thank you, everybody. That's all for today. And I will see you all next time. Take care. Have a great weekend. Stay safe. Okay, stay safe, everyone. All right. End transmission.